When I saw my husband walk into the room holding a toolbox in one hand and my phone in the other, I felt the ground shift beneath me. He wasn't supposed to be home until the evening. My first instinct was relief, until I realized which phone he was holding. Not his. Mine. Unlocked. And in his fingers, my world was about to collapse. I stepped forward, too fast, too obviously, and he looked up at me with that calm, unreadable expression that terrified me more than shouting ever could. He wasn't angry. Not yet. But he had questions. And I had no rehearsed answers. He tapped the screen with his thumb, slowly scrolling, as if savoring every second. Every word. My pulse pounded in my ears like a war drum. His eyes moved, line by line, and I watched his shoulders tighten, his jaw clench. He looked up again, and I didn't recognize him for a moment, like a man discovering he's been living in someone else's dream. The screen lit up again. A message preview. Just a name. One name. The wrong name. His grip on the phone loosened slightly, and I thought for a second he'd drop it. Or throw it. Or crush it. But instead, he placed it on the table, turned away, and said nothing. My mouth was dry, and the silence between us screamed. I wanted to speak, to say anything, but my voice was trapped behind the wall I'd been building for months. A wall of decisions I couldn't undo. I watched his back as he walked out, and I knew the moment had come. Everything was broken. But before I tell you what happened next, let me take you back to the moment it all started. The moment that changed everything. And maybe, if I tell it right, you'll understand how someone like me, a woman who thought she knew herself, ended up risking everything for something she didn't even understand. The house felt larger than usual that morning. Not in a physical way, the walls hadn't stretched, the ceilings hadn't risen. But the emptiness, the quiet, the absolute stillness, it was oppressive. My husband had left early, as planned, off to some long-overdue job site visit that would keep him away for several days. He kissed my cheek at the door, his lips cool, perfunctory. He had the smell of sawdust and aftershave, a combination that once made me feel safe. That morning, it just made me feel small. I stood in the doorway longer than I should have after he drove off, watching the dust rise from his tires as if it were smoke from a disappearing fire. Then I turned and walked back into the kitchen, where the silence settled like a weight across my shoulders. The floor creaked beneath me, too loudly. The hum of the refrigerator was a reminder of how alone I truly was. I wasn't miserable. That's important to understand. My marriage wasn't filled with fights or betrayals. There were no slammed doors or late-night arguments. But there was also no laughter. No unexpected touches. No softness. Just a quiet kind of erosion, like water slowly wearing away at stone. I made myself coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a notepad. I'd been meaning to list the repairs that needed attention, the ones we kept pushing off, the ones we pretended didn't bother us. But the longer I stared at the blank page, the more it began to feel like an inventory of my own life, chipped corners, peeling edges, soft spots beneath the surface. Later, I walked through the hallway and noticed the light fixture still flickered when the hallway switch was flipped. I had asked him to fix it months ago. It was never urgent enough. I jotted it down. Then the bathroom door that always stuck, the guest room window that whistled with the wind. By the end of the hour, I had a full page. And a decision. I'd call someone to help. Not a stranger. Someone I knew. Someone I trusted. His nephew had done carpentry jobs here and there, nothing too elaborate, but enough to be useful. He was young, polite, always quick to lend a hand. He lived not far away, and we hadn't seen him in a while. My fingers hesitated over the contact list, hovering. But I tapped the screen and called. His voice was warm, casual. Surprised, maybe, but not hesitant. Of course, he said. I've got time this week. Be there tomorrow if that works? It did. More than I admitted. That night, I moved through the house like a ghost. I didn't clean obsessively or change the sheets in the guest room, but I did pause in front of the mirror longer than usual. The woman looking back at me wasn't unhappy, just dimmed. Muted. As if someone had taken a vibrant photograph and desaturated it over time. I touched my hair. Not quite silver, not yet. But close. My eyes still had shape, but they'd lost something I couldn't name. I went to bed early. Restless. In the morning, I dressed simply, jeans, soft linen shirt, no makeup. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I'd barely notice him. But when he arrived, tall, sun-browned, in a paint-stained t-shirt, I realized how untrue that was. He hadn't changed much, and yet everything about him felt different. Maybe because I was seeing him through a different lens now. Or maybe because I needed to see someone, anyone, who reminded me what it meant to feel visible. We walked through the house together, and I pointed out the creaks and flaws, trying to stay focused, professional. But there was a moment when he leaned down to inspect the baseboard in the hallway, and I noticed how his shoulder brushed the wall, how his back moved beneath the fabric. I felt the warmth rise in my chest, then immediately scolded myself. Stop it. He was polite. Observant. Not flirtatious. He never crossed a line. Which somehow made it worse. It left space for my imagination to fill in gaps that shouldn't have been open. We worked side by side most of the day. He set up tools, replaced nails, adjusted door frames. I fetched water, moved things out of his way, offered lunch. Conversation was easy, too easy. Like slipping into an old rhythm we never had, but now shared. By late afternoon, we sat on the front steps, drinking lemonade. The air was heavy with late summer heat, and the cicadas buzzed like broken speakers. He told me about a recent road trip he'd taken, the kind you plan spontaneously, with no real purpose. I laughed. Not out of politeness, but because I wanted to. I hadn't realized how rare that was. He looked at me then, just for a moment, and I felt it, the shift. It wasn't romantic. Not yet. It was something subtler. Recognition. He saw something in me that had been buried for years. When he packed up his tools and drove away, I stood at the window and watched. Not like earlier that week, when my husband left. This was different. This time, I felt something ripple beneath the surface. I pressed my fingers to the glass, then pulled them back quickly, ashamed of the gesture. That night, I didn't sleep. My thoughts circled like restless birds. I wasn't in danger. I wasn't foolish. But something had begun. A tiny, flickering possibility. One I should have extinguished immediately. I didn't. And that was the real beginning. He returned the next morning, just after 9. I had barely finished my coffee when I heard the sound of his truck pulling into the gravel driveway. My heart jumped, not out of fear, not even from anticipation, but from something far more unsettling, awareness. That my reaction was no longer neutral. That I was waiting. That I had dressed with more care than usual, light makeup, a clean cotton blouse, hair softly pulled back, and I had no excuse ready for myself. I didn't bother inventing one. He walked in with a casual ease, greeting me with a short wave and an apologetic smile for being a few minutes late, though he wasn't. The same stained t-shirt, different color, similar jeans. Nothing remarkable. And yet I noticed everything, the way his shoulders moved under the fabric, how the sunlight hit the back of his neck when he bent down to unroll the power cord. I tried to focus on the hallway door he was realigning, making small comments here and there as he measured, unscrewed, and tested the hinges. I stayed near, telling myself it was to be helpful. I held the flashlight even when it wasn't needed. I moved a stool he could have easily moved himself. I asked if he wanted something to drink, even though he hadn't asked. He laughed once when the door creaked again after adjustment. "This house doesn't want to change," he said. The words echoed in my mind longer than they should have. I smiled, then turned away to hide how much his voice affected me. Later, we moved outside to the porch. The handrail had come loose in one section, and I stood by as he crouched, inspecting the wood. He gestured for a hammer, and I passed it to him without thinking. Our fingers brushed, just briefly, just enough. I felt it. That small surge. Like touching metal and discovering it was alive. I pulled my hand back too quickly. He didn't react. He kept working, head down, but something had changed in the air between us. It wasn't dramatic. No deep looks, no confessions. Just a charged silence that hummed beneath the surface of everything. After lunch, we found ourselves sitting again on the steps, as we had the day before. The lemonade in our glasses sweated in the heat. The sun had shifted higher, and the air was heavier. He told me about his sister's new apartment. I talked vaguely about my garden. We circled safe topics, as if afraid to step over a line neither of us had defined. Then came the moment I hadn't anticipated. I mentioned an old shed at the back of the property that needed checking, just casually. He offered to take a look, and I followed, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. The shed was dim inside, cooler than outside. Dust hung in the air like memory. He stepped in first, ducking under the low frame, and I followed. We stood too close, but neither of us moved away. He turned toward me, and I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen before, or maybe just hadn't let myself notice. He didn't speak. I didn't either. And then we kissed. It was short. Barely more than a breath. But it was real. Not a mistake. Not a question. A quiet answer neither of us had expected to need. When we pulled apart, I turned quickly and walked out of the shed. He followed a few seconds later, saying nothing. The walk back to the house was silent. We didn't look at each other. Inside, I busied myself with wiping non-existent dust from the counter, moving cups, straightening towels. My hands shook. I heard the sound of his tools being packed up in the other room. I thought he might say something, anything, but he didn't. When he finally stepped into the kitchen to leave, he gave me a nod. Not cold, not indifferent. Just careful. As if something had shifted between us, and neither of us knew how to move forward without breaking it. I closed the door behind him and leaned against it, eyes closed. The weight of that kiss settled over me, not as guilt, not yet. More like realization. That I had crossed a threshold, and the path back was no longer clear. The house felt different after he left. Not just empty, altered. Like something had been removed from it. Or perhaps added. I sat in the living room, trying to make sense of myself. I thought of my husband, where he was, what he might be doing, whether he had noticed any distance between us lately. Probably not. That was the problem. Or maybe the tragedy. The rest of the day passed slowly. I moved from room to room without purpose. I made tea I didn't drink. Started a book I didn't read. Looked at the list of repairs still left undone and felt a strange sense of disconnection from all of it. When night came, I lay in bed with the fan on, watching the shadows shift across the ceiling. I told myself it was a one-time thing. A misstep. A fragile moment that didn't mean anything more than it already had. But I didn't believe it. Because that kiss hadn't felt accidental. It had felt like something inevitable. And that terrified me more than anything else. The morning after, I opened my eyes to a ceiling I knew too well but felt like seeing for the first time. My husband's side of the bed was untouched, and I lay there, staring at the pattern in the plaster, listening to the fan ticking quietly overhead. I hadn't dreamt. I knew that. But part of me wished I had. It would have been easier if it was a dream, something to shake off, something to dismiss with a sigh and a headshake. But I could still feel the moment on my lips. The quiet gravity of it. I moved slowly through my routine, careful and mechanical. I made coffee, watered the plants, opened windows. The scent of dry earth and late summer leaves drifted in. I checked my phone once, then again, then made myself stop. He hadn't called. Of course not. What would he even say? What would I? I avoided the hallway where we'd last spoken. I avoided the porch. I avoided mirrors. He didn't come that day, and I hadn't expected him to. The repairs could wait, and besides, the air between us had thickened into something unspoken, something raw. I spent most of the day cleaning, not because it needed to be done, but because it gave my hands something to do while my mind spiraled. I vacuumed corners no one saw, rearranged dishes that were already in place. Anything to avoid stillness. By mid-afternoon, the heat had settled into the walls, and I found myself sitting in the living room with a notepad. I had tried to journal once years ago, but never kept the habit. This time, the page stayed empty. Words wouldn't come. Everything I felt was layered in contradictions, guilt and curiosity, shame and warmth, fear and a strange kind of aliveness I hadn't tasted in years. That night, I stood by the bedroom window for a long time, watching the driveway. There was no reason to expect him, and yet a small, stupid part of me did. The way someone might expect rain on a cloudless day simply because they want it so badly. The porch light cast a soft cone of yellow across the steps. The air was still. When I finally turned off the lamp and got into bed, I left the window open. The next morning, he texted. Simple. Casual. Need me back today? My hands hovered above the screen longer than they should have. I typed, erased, typed again. Finally, I wrote. Only if you have time. No rush. The reply came quickly. Be there in 30. I stared at the phone like it had said something profound. Then I caught sight of myself in the oven's reflection and hated the expression I wore. Hope. Nervousness. Worse, excitement. When he arrived, he acted as if nothing had happened. And maybe that was the only way we could proceed. He walked in, wiped his boots, unpacked tools, asked about the shelf in the pantry that still needed reinforcing. I nodded and pointed. Neither of us mentioned the shed. Neither of us mentioned the kiss. But everything had changed. Working together felt different now. Every brush of an arm, every moment we stood too close, every silence between sentences, it all buzzed with what we weren't saying. He asked for a level, I passed it. His fingers grazed mine. My breath caught. We moved through it. Midday, we paused for water in the kitchen. I leaned against the counter, watching the light fall across the tiles. He drank slowly, his gaze fixed out the window. I wanted to ask if he regretted it. I wanted to say I did. But both statements would have been lies. Instead, I asked him about his work, and he told me about a project he was doing in a neighboring town. I nodded along, pretending to listen fully, when in truth, I was listening to the cadence of his voice more than the words. It had a calmness to it, a steadiness I hadn't noticed before. After lunch, he worked in the guest room. I stayed close by, sorting through old boxes in the hallway closet, not out of necessity, but to be near. The air was thick with the scent of dust and pine. I dropped a small box of books, and the noise startled us both. He stepped into the hallway quickly, asking if I was okay. I said yes, of course, but the way he looked at me, too long, too directly, made the air feel even heavier. He crouched to help gather the scattered paperbacks. Our hands met again. No words this time. Just another one of those moments where time tightened around us like a thread pulled too taut. I pulled away first. I stood, dusted my hands, said I needed to start dinner. He nodded, but didn't move. In the kitchen, I chopped vegetables without focus. The knife moved, the pieces fell, but my mind was miles away. I thought about the last few days. About the way my body responded to proximity I hadn't expected, hadn't prepared for. About the smile in his eyes when he was focused on a task. About the way my husband hadn't called once, hadn't checked in, hadn't even asked how things were going. It wasn't fair to compare. I knew that. They weren't the same. They weren't supposed to be. But the contrast was too glaring to ignore. Later that evening, after he had packed his things and walked to the truck, he paused before getting in. I stood at the porch, arms crossed more for protection than comfort. He looked at me, his mouth opened slightly, as if searching for a word he didn't find. Then he nodded once and drove away. I remained there long after the sound of the engine had faded. The sky had begun to dim, and a light breeze lifted the edge of my blouse. I felt cold for the first time in days. Inside, I found his lighter on the kitchen counter. A cheap one, black and scratched, but unmistakably his. I stared at it for a long time before putting it in the drawer, the one next to the stove, where we keep takeout menus and pens that barely write. That night, in bed, I pulled the sheet over my shoulder and lay still, listening to the house settle. A creak in the floorboards. A ticking from the hallway clock. All familiar, yet suddenly foreign. I thought about the lighter. About the way he had looked back before leaving. About the heat in the guest room. About what hadn't been said. I thought about my husband. About how much I hadn't told him. About how much I used to tell him. I closed my eyes and waited for sleep, but it didn't come. Just the silence. And the knowledge that nothing was the same anymore. Not outside. Not inside. Not even me. He came back 2 days later. I hadn't asked him to, and he hadn't texted in advance. I just heard the sound of the truck outside, the steady rhythm of tires on gravel, and my stomach tightened before I even made it to the window. There he was, stepping out casually, as if everything was the same. But it wasn't. Not for me. Not for him either. I could tell by the way he paused for a moment before grabbing his tool bag from the back. I opened the door before he knocked. He gave me a half smile, not forced, but not entirely easy either. I moved aside to let him in, and for a few seconds, we just stood there, me holding the door, him stepping past me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off his arm. It was nothing, and yet it was everything. We didn't speak much that morning. He went straight to work on the shelves in the living room. I made coffee and stayed in the kitchen longer than I needed to, pretending to organize the drawers. My hands were busy, but my mind wasn't. It kept circling the same questions, over and over again, like a slow orbit that never quite reached an answer. Was he waiting for me to say something? Was I? When I finally brought him a mug of coffee, he was kneeling near the bookcase, adjusting the level. I placed the mug next to him, careful not to touch anything I didn't have to. He glanced up briefly and nodded his thanks. That was it. No other acknowledgement. No tension. No emotion. But under the silence, something kept humming, an awareness we both carried but chose not to name. The work took him into the guest bedroom again, and I followed with a stack of folded sheets, pretending I had meant to organize the linen closet. The same dance as before, proximity without intent. Words with edges. I asked about the tools he was using, and he explained with just enough detail to keep things neutral. I laughed once at a joke he made about crooked walls, and for a moment, the weight in the room lightened. But it didn't last. Later, while he was under the sink in the laundry room fixing a leak we hadn't planned to address, I stepped out onto the back porch. The sun was bright but mild, the kind of day that made the air feel clean and slow. I sat down on the wooden bench near the railing and closed my eyes. I needed space, even from myself. The longer I sat there, the more I realized how disconnected I felt from the person I had been just weeks ago. Not entirely gone, but blurred around the edges. I couldn't pinpoint when it had started to shift, whether it was the quiet years of a marriage growing colder, or the first time he looked at me not like someone older, but simply like someone. I hadn't planned any of this. I still wasn't planning anything. But I was no longer in control of the current I had stepped into. When I heard the screen door open behind me, I didn't turn. He stood there for a moment, then walked over and sat at the opposite end of the bench. The wood creaked slightly beneath his weight. We didn't speak. Just sat, the silence between us thick, not uncomfortable, just full. Full of what hadn't been said, what wouldn't be said. At one point, he shifted slightly, turning his head to glance at me. I felt it without seeing it. I kept my eyes on the trees. The wind moved through the leaves in slow waves, and for some reason, I wanted to cry. But I didn't. Eventually, he stood. Said something about finishing up in the laundry room. I nodded, still looking straight ahead. The afternoon passed in fragments. He worked quietly, efficiently, and I kept myself busy with nothing. Rearranging books, wiping counters that weren't dirty, pretending to care about tasks that didn't need doing. The distance between us was deliberate, but it was thin, like tissue, fragile and easily torn. As he packed up his things near the end of the day, I lingered by the kitchen sink, watching the light fade outside. The shadows stretched longer across the lawn, and the air had taken on that subtle change that signaled the end of summer. Something final. Something closing. Before he left, he asked if I needed anything else fixed. The question felt heavier than it should have. I shook my head, said no, thank you. He nodded and opened the door. But just before stepping out, he turned back and said he might not be able to come next week. Something about helping a friend move. I said I understood. And I did. But I didn't like it. After he left, I stood alone in the entryway for a long time. I could still smell sawdust and sun-warmed denim in the air. It clung to the walls. To me. That night, I found myself walking through the house in the dark, barefoot, the boards cool under my feet. I passed the guest room, paused by the hallway where he'd knelt just hours earlier, looked out the back window toward the bench where we hadn't spoken. Everything looked the same. But I had changed. I was changing still. In the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and reached into the drawer where I'd placed his lighter. I held it in my palm, feeling its weight. It wasn't heavy, but it carried more than it should. A small object with too much meaning. I clicked it once. The flame flared, then vanished. I didn't know what I was waiting for. I didn't know what would happen next. But I knew the line we had stepped across wasn't something I could pretend didn't exist. And whether he came back next week or never again, the space he had opened inside me wasn't going to close on its own. I had always thought of temptation as something loud. Obvious. Like flashing lights or a shouted warning. But it wasn't. It was quiet. It was patient. It sat beside you on a porch and said nothing. It looked at you in silence and waited. And then, without raising its voice, it changed everything. The house was quieter than usual that week. Not in the way homes are when no one's there. I'd grown used to that kind of silence. This was different. It was the silence of something withheld, something waiting. I moved through the rooms with a sense of rehearsal, repeating actions without intention, folding towels I wouldn't use, checking for dust on surfaces already clean, watering plants that hadn't dried. It gave me motion, but not peace. He didn't come for 3 days. He hadn't said exactly when he'd be back, and I hadn't asked. But the longer he stayed away, the more his absence filled the house. Not just physically, he had left no jacket or tool behind, but something of him lingered. The echo of where he'd stood, the scent that sometimes drifted through a room I swore I hadn't entered. Or maybe that was my imagination, reshaping the air to feel less empty. I told myself I needed the break. I needed space to clear my head, remind myself of the lines I was crossing, or about to. But truthfully, I waited. Every morning, I woke earlier than usual and opened the curtains facing the driveway before even brushing my teeth. Just in case. When he did return, it was without announcement. I heard the truck while I was sweeping the back porch. I paused, broom in hand, and waited. The sound stopped. Then came footsteps on gravel. When I turned, he was already walking toward the side gate, toolbox in hand, eyes shaded beneath his cap. I didn't speak as I let him in. He smiled faintly, nodded toward the porch railing. Thought I'd fix this before it gives out completely. I nodded too, stepping back to give him room, though there was plenty. As he bent to inspect the loose panel, I returned to sweeping. Each pass of the broom over the boards felt louder than usual, like an announcement I didn't intend to make. I tried to steady my breathing, focus on the rhythm, but my hands betrayed me. They trembled only slightly, but enough. Later, he asked for water. I brought it to him without a word. He drank quickly, wiping his forehead with the back of his arm. His shirt clung to his back, damp with effort and heat. I looked away, but the image stayed. We worked near each other most of the day. Sometimes side by side, sometimes across the same room. The proximity made everything louder, each glance, each pause, each exchange of tools. There were no accidents, no brushes of hands or lingering touches. But there didn't need to be. The awareness was constant, alive under the surface like a current humming through the floorboards. At some point, I walked into the kitchen to prepare a late lunch. As I stood slicing tomatoes, I heard his voice behind me. "Smells good in here." I didn't turn. I just said, "It's nothing special." He moved closer. Not enough to touch, just enough for presence. I felt it before I heard the shift in his breathing. I knew if I turned, we'd be standing too close. I knew what might happen. But I turned anyway. And we kissed. It was brief. Quiet. Not frantic or uncertain. It was controlled. Deliberate. But still there. I stepped back first. He didn't apologize. Neither did I. He only looked at me for a moment, and then, as if nothing had happened, asked if I needed him to finish the pantry shelf next. I nodded, voice caught somewhere in my throat. The rest of the day passed in a kind of suspended clarity. I moved through it as if underwater, aware, but muted. I watched him work, saw how he avoided my gaze now, how he kept his words shorter, his posture tighter. I understood. We had opened something neither of us fully knew how to close. He left earlier than usual. I didn't walk him to the door this time. I stayed in the kitchen, wiping down an already clean counter, listening to the click of the door, the distant crunch of gravel as he drove away. When the house was still again, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at nothing. I didn't cry. I didn't feel guilt the way I expected. Instead, what I felt was a slow-burning confusion, a knot of questions with no clear beginning or end. Why had I let it happen again? What did it mean? Did I want it to continue? I thought of my husband. I tried to summon his face, the sound of his voice when he left messages. I tried to remember the last time he had touched me without purpose. I couldn't. Not clearly. Everything had faded into patterns. Habits. Polite exchanges. The absence of conflict masquerading as peace. But what disturbed me more than anything was the part of me that didn't want to go back to normal. That didn't want things to be okay again. That didn't want to rewind. That night, I avoided the bedroom. I fell asleep on the couch with the lights still on, the television playing something I couldn't follow, my body turned away from the hallway, from the closed door, from myself. In the early hours of the morning, I woke with a start, not from a dream, but from the sound of silence. The TV had gone quiet. The house felt strange. I sat up slowly, eyes adjusting, muscles sore from the awkward position I had fallen asleep in. I stood, turned off the lamp, and made my way to the bathroom. On the way, I passed the kitchen. I paused. The drawer was slightly open, the one where I had placed the lighter. I didn't remember leaving it that way. I walked over and pulled it open fully. It was still there, exactly where I had left it. I picked it up, felt the metal cool against my skin. I clicked it once. No flame. Then I clicked again. A small, stubborn flicker. It felt like a metaphor I wasn't ready to understand. Or maybe one I understood all too well. I placed it back, closed the drawer, and walked back to the hallway. I paused at the bedroom door but didn't go in. Instead, I sat on the edge of the guest bed, the one he had fixed, the one we hadn't touched. And I waited for sleep to come. It didn't. But I stayed there anyway. Because some part of me knew that if I stepped through that door, the one to my bedroom, the one to the life I had always lived, something inside me might start to shut down again. And I wasn't sure I could survive that twice. The next morning began the same way so many others had, coffee brewed before sunrise, curtains drawn open with slow hands, silence spilling across the kitchen tiles like water. But there was something in the air I couldn't name, a feeling that clung to me like humidity, weightless and heavy all at once. It wasn't fear. I had moved beyond fear. It wasn't anticipation either, not exactly. It was attention, quiet and still, as though the day itself was holding its breath. I didn't know if he would come. After the second kiss, things had shifted again, not drastically, not loudly, but undeniably. There had been no text, no conversation. Just the echo of the moment and the way the air changed in the room after he left. So I waited. Not by the window. Not obviously. I busied myself with folding laundry, dusting the baseboards, anything to keep my hands moving. But my ears listened for the sound of gravel crunching under tires, for a door closing too softly to be anything but deliberate. When the knock came, it startled me. Not the sound itself, but the fact that it was a knock. He never knocked. He just walked in, always had. The knock was a warning. Or a question. I opened the door and found him standing there with a half-step of space between us. He looked different. Not in the face or the posture, he was the same. But something in his eyes had changed. They looked clearer somehow. Not calm, not conflicted. Just aware. I came to finish the trim in the hallway, he said. I nodded and stepped aside. It's still waiting. He set his bag down just inside the entry and moved past me, straight toward the tools we'd left in the dining room. I followed, not close, but not distant either. The rhythm of the morning fell into place, but not like before. Not automatic. Every movement, every step, felt measured now, careful. As if we were both trying to speak a new language we didn't fully understand. While he worked, I stayed in the living room sorting through a box of old photo frames. I wasn't really looking at them. I was watching the doorway, listening to the faint sounds of him hammering, adjusting, breathing. I could feel him in the house, not just his presence, but the echo of everything that had happened. It sat in the corners. It pressed into the spaces between us. At one point, I heard another sound, a second vehicle outside, a door slamming with force. I stood up too quickly, knocking over the box. Frames scattered across the floor, glass clinking lightly but none breaking. I crouched to pick them up, hands trembling slightly, breath caught somewhere in my chest. Through the front window, I saw the familiar figure before I heard the voice. My husband. He was home early. Unannounced. He hadn't texted. Hadn't called. I didn't know what brought him home, a cancelled meeting, a change in schedule, maybe nothing. Maybe it didn't matter. But he was walking toward the door, briefcase in hand, brow furrowed against the morning sun. Panic didn't hit me the way I imagined it might. It wasn't a rush of dread or guilt. It was cold. Steady. Like ice water poured through my veins. I stood, glanced quickly at the hallway, and saw him there, the one I hadn't expected to still be inside. He hadn't heard the car. Or if he had, he hadn't reacted. I walked fast, my feet silent on the hardwood. He looked up from his work as I approached, confusion flickering across his face. I didn't speak. I just held his gaze, and in that look, I hoped he understood. Be invisible. Be gone. He nodded, barely perceptible, and without another word, stepped away from the wall and moved quickly through the kitchen to the back door. At the same moment, the front door opened. I turned toward it, heart thudding, palms damp. He walked in with a smile that didn't fully reach his eyes, distracted, tired. He looked around the house as if searching for something familiar that he'd left behind weeks ago. Didn't mean to surprise you, he said, setting his case down. You did, I replied, and I wasn't lying. He kissed my cheek absent-mindedly, already moving past me toward the kitchen. I followed him slowly, glancing once behind me toward the hallway. Empty. In the kitchen, the back door was ajar. Just slightly. I closed it gently. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. Everything okay here? I nodded. Quiet week. Just trying to finish the little things. He didn't seem suspicious. Or maybe he didn't care to notice. His eyes moved around the space, landing on nothing. I made lunch while he unpacked. We talked about his trip, the people he'd met, the slow meetings and missed flights. I listened, I nodded, I smiled in the right places. I performed my role without flaw. But inside, I was still standing in the hallway, looking into those eyes, silently pleading for silence. And receiving it. That night, we ate dinner in front of the television. Something forgettable played. I didn't taste the food. I barely heard the dialogue. Every time the wind rattled a window or the fridge kicked on, my body tensed. I wasn't afraid of being caught. I was afraid of what I had become capable of, the ease with which I hid. Later, as I washed the dishes, I noticed a small object near the sink. At first, I didn't recognize it. Then I did. A tool. A small screwdriver. Left behind. I stared at it for a long time. He hadn't taken everything with him. Or maybe he had left it on purpose. I dried it carefully and placed it inside the drawer, the one where I'd kept the lighter. Now, there were 2 items. 2 symbols. 2 secrets. That night, lying beside a man who hadn't noticed the tremble in my hands or the silence in my voice. I stared at the ceiling and counted each breath. I tried not to think about the hallway, or the kitchen, or the way his eyes had met mine just before he disappeared through the back door. But I couldn't stop. Because I knew something now. This wasn't going away. It was only beginning. The house had settled into a strange rhythm now. My husband's presence was both grounding and suffocating, a reminder of the life I was supposed to be living and the role I had rehearsed for decades. I moved through each day with practiced ease, careful in every step, every gesture, as though the walls had grown ears in memory. He seemed content to be home again, falling into his own patterns with little question. But I had changed. And nothing I did felt natural anymore. I woke up earlier than him every morning, letting the silence hold me before the noise of his day began. He read the paper with coffee, always black, always from the chipped mug he refused to replace. I watched him sometimes from across the table, wondering if he saw me at all, not just physically, but truly. Did he notice the tension in my shoulders? The way my fingers lingered too long on the drawer handle? Did he notice I'd stopped asking about his work? He didn't. Or didn't want to. The truth hovered between us like dust in sunlight. Unnoticed unless you really looked. And neither of us looked too closely. The man I shouldn't have kissed didn't return that week. Not a text, not a visit, not even a forgotten item this time. I waited in silence, checking my phone more than I admitted, listening to every car passing the house with hope I tried to bury. But nothing came. He had vanished. Or maybe he had understood that it was time to stop. But I couldn't. One afternoon, after my husband left for a meeting in town, I stood in the middle of the kitchen staring at the drawer. The one where the lighter still rested beside the small screwdriver. I opened it slowly. They were still there. 2 quiet confessions no one had yet heard. I touched them both, let my fingers hover, then closed the drawer again. Later that day, I walked to the back of the property. The shed he once stood in, fixing a broken hinge, looked untouched since that day. The tools were gone, the dust had returned. I pushed the door open anyway and stepped inside. The air was dry, stale, but held a memory. I leaned against the frame, closed my eyes, and let it wash over me. It wasn't just about him. Or me. It was about the part of me that had felt alive in his presence, a part that had gone quiet for years. I didn't want chaos. I didn't want betrayal. But I couldn't deny what I had felt, even now, in his absence. That night, after dinner, my husband asked if I wanted to join him for a drive the next day. Get out of the house for a while, he said. I nodded, said sure, and smiled the kind of smile I'd perfected over time. I meant none of it. I didn't want to go anywhere with him. I didn't want to sit beside him in the car, listening to the same radio station, pretending to care about the errands we'd run. But I agreed. Because it was easier. Because pretending had become part of breathing. The next morning, we drove into town. The air was cooler, the sky cloudless, and the streets busier than usual. He stopped for gas and coffee, and I waited in the passenger seat, fingers curled around my phone like a lifeline I didn't know how to use. I scrolled through nothing. Refreshed empty screens. Waited for something, anything, that might shake the numbness. When we returned home in the early afternoon, something felt different. The front gate was ajar. My husband noticed it first and muttered something about wind or neighbors. I followed him inside, heart suddenly thudding louder than reason allowed. Everything looked normal, mostly. But I knew before I saw it. Something had shifted. On the hallway table, just near the stairs, was an envelope. Unmarked. White. Not sealed. I reached it first. Inside, a note. No name. Just a single line, handwritten in small, sharp lettering. I knew instantly, "You left the window open." My blood went cold. He had been here. Not long ago. Maybe minutes. Maybe while we were gone. I tucked the note into my pocket before my husband could see. He was already in the kitchen, oblivious, commenting about the groceries needing to be put away. I moved with shaking hands, placing things in the fridge, wiping the counter that didn't need wiping. My mind spun in every direction at once. Why had he come? Why leave a note? Why now, after disappearing for days? That night, when my husband was asleep, I sat on the edge of the bed holding the note. The paper was thin, folded twice, already beginning to crease from my hands. I read it again. You left the window open. Was it literal? Symbolic? A warning? An invitation? I didn't know. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the house. The windows were all closed. I checked them twice. And yet, something stayed open, inside me. By afternoon, I couldn't take the waiting anymore. I texted him. Short. Measured. Just 2 words, "Are you okay?" The message delivered. No response. Hours passed. Evening came, and with it, silence. My husband grilled chicken on the patio. I poured wine I didn't want. We spoke in small talk. I nodded and laughed when it was expected. But my mind was elsewhere, circling, always circling. Just after 9, my phone vibrated. A message. Tomorrow. Same place. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. The next day, I told my husband I needed to visit the hardware store. Said I wanted to check on paint samples for the hallway. He didn't question it. I drove past the store. Kept going. Heart pounding. And when I saw him, standing by his truck, arms crossed, waiting in the shade of the same lot where we once bought tools, I didn't stop to question myself. We looked at each other in silence. And we spent the night together. The morning after was oddly quiet. Not just around me, but inside me. As if something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of my body, my thoughts, my sense of time. There was no panic. No thrill. No shame crashing down like I had always imagined there would be. Just a strange, steady stillness, the kind that settles over a place after a storm has passed and before anyone realizes what's been broken. I drove home slowly, windows down, letting the early light spill into the car. The roads were mostly empty, and the world felt far away. I passed familiar landmarks, the gas station where we always stopped for coffee, the stretch of woods that darkened early in the day, but they looked unfamiliar now, or maybe I just looked at them differently. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw that the morning paper was already on the porch. My husband was awake. The house was awake. And I was returning not just from a night away, but from somewhere farther, somewhere I couldn't map. I sat in the car for a few moments longer, the engine off, the keys resting in my lap. My hands trembled only slightly. Inside, I moved quietly. I changed clothes in the bathroom, folded what I had worn the night before, and placed it in the hamper as though it might erase anything that lingered. I splashed cold water on my face, stared at my reflection, and looked for signs of change. But nothing betrayed me. The face staring back was the same, only my eyes were different. Less lost. Or perhaps more. He was in the kitchen when I came down. Toast in the toaster, his mug full, the news murmuring softly from the radio. He glanced up and smiled without looking closely. Early for a Saturday. I nodded, reached for a second cup. Couldn't sleep. "Where'd you go?" he asked, not accusatory, just curious. I shrugged. "Drove a bit. Needed air." He accepted it. That's the thing about routine, it teaches you not to question things that don't make enough noise. I sat with him, drank coffee, even managed to comment on the weather. I moved through the morning like a woman rehearsing lines she used to know by heart. The rest of the day passed like any other. He mowed the lawn. I swept the garage. We said little, and none of it mattered. But underneath the normality, I carried a new weight. Not heavy. Not painful. Just undeniable. Late in the afternoon, a knock came at the door. Not his. Not anyone's I expected. When I opened it, I saw a face I hadn't seen in months, a friend of my husband's, someone I barely knew but who had always hovered on the edge of our lives. He smiled, polite but distracted. "Is he around?" he asked. I stepped aside and let him in. They spoke briefly in the hallway, voices low. I heard a laugh, then footsteps moving toward the living room. I stayed in the kitchen, washing dishes that didn't need washing. At one point, I looked up and saw him watching me from the doorway, the friend. His eyes lingered a second too long. Something in them was sharp. Knowing. Later, after he left, I asked casually, what did he need? "Nothing much," my husband said, already moving on. "Just catching up." But I kept thinking about that look. It hadn't been random. It hadn't been innocent. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed listening to every creak of the house, every passing car. I replayed the day again and again, the knock, the eyes, the silence between the words. Something about it felt wrong. Or exposed. The next morning, I checked the back door. Locked. The windows? All shut. Still, I felt seen. Not entirely, not fully. But enough for discomfort. He didn't message me again. No calls. No signs. As if what happened had completed something, closed a loop. And maybe it had. Maybe it was the final act in a quiet unraveling. Still, I waited. Days passed. Then a week. Life returned to its usual shape, at least on the outside. My husband worked late. I made dinners that went uneaten. The routine resumed like a song that had only missed a beat. But I didn't return to who I was. I couldn't. One evening, while cleaning out the hall closet, I came across a jacket I didn't recognize at first. Dark fabric. Slightly worn. My fingers paused on the zipper. And then I remembered. He had worn it the day he came to fix the porch, the day before everything changed. I stared at it, unsure how it had ended up here. Had he left it on purpose? Had I simply forgotten? Or had it been tucked away, like a memory trying to hide? I folded it carefully, pressed it between the other coats. I didn't throw it away. I didn't mention it. Some things don't need to be spoken to be felt. That night, during dinner, my husband told me about a trip he had to take the following week. "Just a few days," he said. "Back by Friday." I nodded. "Safe travels." He smiled and asked if I'd be okay here alone. "I always am," I said. And we both left it at that. When he left the following morning, I watched the car disappear down the road and felt the familiar mix of relief and dread. The house was mine again. The silence was mine. But I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't drive anywhere. I stayed still. By afternoon, the friend returned. No call. No warning. Just a knock, and when I opened the door, he was already looking past me, into the house. "I saw him leave," he said. "I didn't invite him in. I didn't step aside. What do you want? His smile didn't reach his eyes. Nothing. Just wanted to say hello. But the air between us told a different story. He knew. I closed the door slowly, firmly, and leaned my back against it. My breath was shallow. My heart louder than the silence around me. He had seen something. Or heard. Or suspected. The secret wasn't secret anymore. Not fully. And now, everything was about to shift again. After he left, I didn't move for a long time. I stood by the door, hand resting on the wood as though still feeling the warmth of it, the echo of the knock that had just rattled my world a little more than I wanted to admit. The hallway behind me stretched like a tunnel, quiet and unmoving. The house felt sealed and exposed all at once. I took one breath, then another, trying to slow the pace of something I couldn't name, not quite panic, not quite regret, but close to both. He knew. Not the man I had kissed. Not my husband. The other one. The watcher. He had seen something. Or maybe just enough to suspect. Maybe even more than that. Maybe he had caught a glimpse of a touch, a glance, a shift in my face I hadn't controlled well enough. And now, like a loose thread, the knowledge hung between us, unspoken but dangerous. Not because I believed he would speak, but because I knew what silence could do. It could sharpen suspicion, feed it, make it grow. I locked the door and drew the curtain, then walked to the kitchen on unsteady legs. The house, just moments ago familiar, now felt uncertain, like someone had rearranged the furniture ever so slightly. The walls leaned closer, the windows too bright. I moved through the space like I didn't belong in it anymore, even though it had been mine for years. The drawer by the stove was still there, the lighter, the screwdriver, the folded note. I opened it slowly, let my fingers touch each object in turn. My own little archive of everything I hadn't said. Everything I had done. They didn't speak, but I heard them. My husband would be home in 2 days. The thought landed like a dropped plate, soft in sound but heavy in meaning. 2 days before everything had to look normal again. 2 days before I had to pick up the lines of a play I no longer believed in. 2 days to decide what kind of woman I was willing to keep pretending to be. I didn't sleep that night. I moved from room to room as the hours crawled. I sat on the couch in the dark, the television muted, the silence around me thick and constant. My mind circled over memories of the past weeks, the first day he walked into my house with tools and a smile, the brush of fingers, the quiet porch, the weight of a kiss, the sting of returning to a man who hadn't noticed the difference in my eyes. And then the hotel. The night we hadn't spoken about. The night that couldn't be undone. By morning, I was exhausted but alert. As if my body had accepted that sleep was a luxury I no longer deserved. I made coffee, drank it cold, opened the windows to let in the light. The day outside looked ordinary, birds chirping, wind shifting the branches, a car or two passing in the distance. But it felt unreal. Like a painting trying too hard to seem alive. Around noon, a neighbor stopped by to drop off some extra tomatoes from their garden. I accepted them with a smile, thanked her too warmly. I imagined what I must have looked like, tidy, pleasant, calm. The kind of woman who spent her mornings baking or reading. The kind of woman who didn't keep secrets in drawers or meet younger men in parking lots. The kind of woman I used to be. I placed the tomatoes in a bowl and sat beside them at the table. I stared at their skin, glossy, red, too perfect, and felt something strange rise in me. A kind of grief. Not for the lie. Not for the loss. But for the way the truth had taken root so quietly that I hadn't noticed until it was already too late. By afternoon, I knew I needed air. I grabbed my keys and left without a plan. I didn't go far. I drove toward the outskirts of town, past the grocery store, past the small church with the broken bell tower, past the park where we used to walk when we still held hands. I ended up by the lake. I parked near the water's edge and stepped out, gravel crunching beneath my shoes. The lake was still, pale blue under the late summer sun. A few families sat nearby, children laughing, dogs barking. Their noise felt distant, like I was behind glass. I walked slowly toward the dock and sat at the edge, shoes off, feet hanging just above the water. The breeze was soft, steady. It moved my hair across my face, cooled the back of my neck. I closed my eyes and tried to listen, not to the sounds around me, but to myself. What did I want? Not escape. Not fantasy. Not even forgiveness. Just clarity. I had thought the affair, if it could be called that, would leave me shattered with guilt. That I would be unable to look at myself, at my husband, at the world I had built. But that hadn't happened. Instead, what remained was a quieter ache, the realization that I had stepped outside the lines not out of recklessness, but out of need. That somewhere along the way, I had disappeared into a version of myself that existed only in service of others, and for one brief moment, I had reached for something that felt like truth. It was selfish. I knew that. But it was also honest. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if he would come back, if the friend would speak, if my husband would notice the cracks now spreading through the walls of our carefully constructed life. I didn't know if I would confess, or continue to wear the face he needed me to wear. But I knew I couldn't go back to being invisible. That night, I sat on the back porch as the sun dipped behind the trees. The air was warm, thick with the smell of grass and distant barbecue smoke. I held the note again, you left the window open, and let it rest in my lap. I hadn't closed it. Not really. And now, I wasn't sure I ever would.